Somewhere in the Amazon basin, a healer selects a specific leaf from a specific tree, not because he read it in a book and not because a laboratory confirmed its properties. He knows it because his grandmother showed him, and her grandmother showed her. And this knowledge has traveled, unbroken, for at least 400 years. Western science over the last century has documented thousands of medicinal plants. Roughly 80% of those discoveries trace directly back to indigenous communities who already knew about them. But here is what those studies rarely ask. How did they know? How does knowledge survive without writing, without laboratories, without universities? That is the question this video is actually about. Before we go further, let's be precise about what we mean when we say indigenous knowledge. This is not folklore. It is not superstition dressed up for anthropology papers. Indigenous knowledge, often called traditional ecological knowledge or TKEK in academic literature, refers to the cumulative body of knowledge, practices, and beliefs about the relationships between living beings, including humans, and their environment. It evolves by adaptive processes and is handed down through generations by cultural transmission. That definition comes from Fikret Burks, one of the most cited researchers in this field, whose 1999 book Sacred Ecology became a foundational academic text on the subject. Now, two things matter immediately. First, indigenous knowledge is not one thing. There are roughly 5,000 distinct indigenous cultures currently active on Earth, and each carries its own epistemology, its own internal logic of what counts as knowledge, how it is verified, and who holds it. Second, calling it traditional does not mean it is frozen in time. Indigenous knowledge systems have been observing, testing, adapting, and updating for thousands of years. The Maori of New Zealand, for example, had detailed astronomical calendars that accurately predicted planting seasons and ocean migration patterns long before European contact. That is not tradition as nostalgia. That is tradition as a living, functional system. But here is where it gets interesting. The characteristics that define how indigenous knowledge works, the architecture behind it, are remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other. A healer in Papua New Guinea and an elder in the Navajo Nation operating completely independently have developed knowledge systems that share the same structural features. That is not a coincidence. And it tells us something important about how human beings, left to their own relationship with the natural world, come to know things. The first characteristic of indigenous knowledge is the one that confuses outsiders most. It is almost entirely oral. No written records, no databases, no archives in climate-controlled rooms. For scholars trained in text-based traditions, this immediately raises a question. How does oral knowledge stay accurate over centuries? The answer requires us to rethink what accuracy means. Walter Ong, the philosopher and linguist whose 1982 work Orality and Literacy remains essential reading, argued that oral cultures do not simply have a different way of storing information. They have a fundamentally different relationship with knowledge itself. In oral traditions, knowledge is not a static fact to be retrieved. It is a living performance, reenacted and recalibrated with each telling, and the mechanisms for maintaining that accuracy are sophisticated. Repetition, rhythm, and rhyme are not decorative. They are mnemonic architecture. The oral epics of the Yoruba, the songlines of Aboriginal Australians, the chanted genealogies of Hawaiian kahunas, these are not poetry for poetry's sake. They are data structures. The Aboriginal songlines of Australia deserve particular attention. Bruce Chatwin described them in 1987 as a labyrinth of invisible pathways which meander all over Australia. But they are more than paths. A songline encodes navigation data, ecological observations, seasonal patterns, water sources, and social law into a sung sequence that a trained elder can follow across hundreds of kilometers of terrain. The land becomes the library, the song is the index. Researchers at the University of New South Wales published findings in 2020 suggesting that certain songlines may encode geological events dating back more than 7,000 years, including changes in sea levels at the end of the last ice age. 7,000 years of accurate oral memory. But oral transmission is not just about memory. It is about relationship. Knowledge in oral cultures is entrusted to specific people: elders, healers, storytellers, navigators. The relationship between the keeper and the knowledge is itself part of the knowledge. Who you learn from, in what context, under what conditions. These are not incidental details. They are part of the epistemological record. This is why the destruction of indigenous communities does not just erase culture. It destroys irreplaceable intellectual archives assembled over thousands of years that exist nowhere else. The second characteristic is one that modern knowledge systems often treat as a flaw. Indigenous knowledge is deeply, specifically, irreducibly local. It does not generalize well because it was never designed to. It was designed to know one place with absolute precision. The Inuit people of the Canadian Arctic have over 50 documented terms for different types of snow and ice, not because their language is imprecise, but because their survival depended on distinguishing conditions that a single word like snow would collapse into invisibility. Siku means sea ice. Pukak means the granular sugar snow beneath the surface that weakens snowpack. Upsik is wind-compressed snow, stable enough to cut into blocks. Each of those distinctions is a safety system. Anthropologist Richard Nelson spent years with the Koyukon people of Alaska documenting their ecological knowledge. What he found, published in Make Prayers to the Raven in 1983, was that these communities held functional knowledge about species behavior, population dynamics, and ecosystem relationships that professional ecologists were only beginning to articulate, and their knowledge was calibrated specifically to their watershed, their forest, their game migration routes, not to some generalized boreal ecosystem. This place specificity is not a limitation. It is a feature. General principles about ecosystems have their uses, but knowing that the salmon run in this particular tributary runs 3 days earlier after a late snow in the specific mountain pass to the northeast, that kind of knowledge takes generations of precise observation to accumulate, and it cannot be learned anywhere else. Climate scientists have increasingly turned to indigenous ecological knowledge for exactly this reason. Long-term instrumental climate records rarely extend beyond 150 years. Indigenous communities in the same locations have been observing and recording, orally, ceremonially, in practice, for exponentially longer. The Arctic Council's Arctic Climate Impact Assessment of 2004 explicitly noted that indigenous knowledge provided critical, long-term baseline data that scientific records alone could not supply. Place-specific knowledge is not knowledge about one place. It is a different level of resolution about the world, achieved by sustained attention over centuries. But to understand how that attention is sustained, we need to talk about what holds it together. In Western academic traditions, knowledge has an author. A researcher publishes a finding. Their name is on it. Their institution claims the work. The knowledge belongs to an individual at a point in time. Indigenous knowledge has no author. It belongs to the community across time. This is not a rhetorical distinction. It changes the entire architecture of how knowledge is produced, validated, and transmitted. When a Quechua farmer in the Peruvian Andes selects seed varieties for a particular field, she is drawing on a living database that her community has maintained for over 8,000 years. The potato, in its roughly 4,000 cultivated varieties found in the Andes, is one of the most sophisticated long-term agricultural experiments in human history. Each variety was selected, tested, and refined over generations for specific soil types, altitudes, drought tolerance, disease resistance, and storage qualities. No single person designed this. No institution funded it. It emerged from thousands of small decisions made by thousands of people who shared their results through the community across time. The Potato Park of Pasac, Peru, maintained by the Quechua Aymara community with support from the International Potato Center, now conserves over 900 traditional varieties that global seed banks do not hold. The knowledge of how to grow them, when to grow them, and how to read the soil and weather signs that inform those decisions lives in the community, not in any archive. Intergenerational transmission also means that indigenous knowledge has built-in error correction. When an elder teaches a practice and it fails, the community observes. When it succeeds, it is reinforced. Over generations, this process filters out noise and consolidates what genuinely works. It is empirical, even if the empiricism is embedded in ceremony and story rather than journal articles. Anthropologist Paul Silito, writing in the journal Current Anthropology in 1998, described indigenous knowledge validation as an ongoing social process rather than a fixed body of facts. The knowledge is alive because the community is alive. But what makes the community willing to carry that knowledge? What binds the obligation to transmit? The answer takes us into the deepest characteristic of all. Western knowledge systems divide. There is medicine, and there is ecology, and there is agriculture, and there is law, and there is religion. Each has its own department, its own methodology, its own journals. Indigenous knowledge does not divide. For the vast majority of indigenous knowledge systems, what we would call practical knowledge and what we would call spiritual belief are not separate categories. They are the same thing, described from different angles. A Lakota elder would not understand the question, is your relationship to the bison spiritual or practical? The question itself would seem confused. This integration is not a sign that indigenous knowledge is less rigorous. It is a different organizing principle. Where Western science seeks to isolate variables, indigenous knowledge seeks to understand relationships in their totality. Ecologist Robin Wall Kimmerer, a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and a professor at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, explored this in her 2013 book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She describes how the Potawatomi word pufpowi, the force that causes mushrooms to push up from the earth overnight, encodes a whole ontology, a recognition that the living world is animated by agency and relationship, not just by chemical process. Spiritual ceremony in most indigenous traditions is not separate from ecological management. The Haida of the Pacific Northwest conduct strict harvest protocols during salmon, runs that function as population management. The ceremonies surrounding the harvest are not decorations on top of the practice. They are the mechanism by which the practice is enforced, transmitted, and made meaningful enough to sustain across generations. This is the functional genius of spiritual integration in indigenous knowledge systems. Ceremony and taboo create behavioral norms that serve ecological purposes, without requiring ecological jargon to justify them. You protect the forest not because a scientist told you about biodiversity, but because the forest has personhood, relationships, obligations. The obligation runs both ways. Darrell Posey, the ethnobiologist who founded the International Society of Ethnobiology, argued before his death in 2001 that this holism made indigenous knowledge systems among the most sophisticated forms of ecological management ever developed, precisely because they integrated human social behavior into the ecosystem model rather than treating humans as external observers. The ecosystem is not something indigenous people study. It is something they are part of. That is not a spiritual metaphor. That is a systems thinking framework. To understand indigenous knowledge fully, we have to stop treating it as a collection of facts and start seeing it as a way of life. A complete epistemology that begins the moment a person is born and continues past the moment they die. In many Andean traditions, a child's birth is observed for signs, weather patterns, animal behavior, the position of stars, that will inform the community's understanding of that child's relationship to the natural world. The naming ceremony among the Yoruba of West Africa involves a detailed ritual in which the child is introduced to water, to the earth, to fires, symbolic acknowledgments that the child is entering into relationships with the living world, not arriving as a blank individual. From the earliest age, learning is not didactic. A child does not sit in a classroom and receive information. They accompany adults, they watch, they practice, they fail in low-stakes environments where failure teaches rather than harms. The transition to adult knowledge is almost never gradual in indigenous traditions. It is marked by ceremony, by deliberate threshold crossing, by the community formally recognizing that this person is now ready to hold a different category of responsibility. The vision quest of many Plains nations, the initiation ceremonies of the San people of Southern Africa, the formal apprenticeship to a healer in Amazonian curanderismo, all of these serve the same structural function. They mark the moment when a young person moves from receiving knowledge passively to actively participating in its continuation. This is not ritual for ritual's sake. It creates a psychological contract. After initiation, the knowledge is yours to carry. That changes how you hold it. That changes how you hold it. In adult life, indigenous knowledge is not stored and retrieved. It is continuously practiced. The farmer who reads the soil each morning, the fisherman who observes the behavior of birds to locate fish, the healer who adjusts prescriptions based on the specific patient's constitution, history, and the season. Anthropologist Tim Ingold, in his 2000 work The Perception of the Environment, argued that in indigenous traditions, knowledge is not in the head but in the relationship between the person and their environment. It is skill, not information. And skill can only be maintained through continuous practice. As a person ages, their relationship to knowledge shifts. They move from practitioner to teacher, from user to guardian. The elder in most indigenous traditions is not simply older. They are a qualitatively different kind of knower. Someone whose decades of observation have produced a depth of pattern recognition that younger community members have not yet achieved. When an elder dies without transmitting their knowledge, the community does not simply lose a person, they lose an irreplaceable library. In 2003, linguist and activist K. David Harrison documented, in his later work When Languages Die, that the death of a language carrying indigenous knowledge represents the extinction of an entire way of categorizing and relating to the world. But indigenous knowledge systems have always known this vulnerability, and they have addressed it not by creating archives, but by weaving the obligation to transmit into the spiritual and ceremonial fabric of life itself. Death in most indigenous traditions is not an ending of the individual's relationship to the community's knowledge. It is a transition. The ancestor joins the community of those who came before, and their knowledge, now confirmed by the test of time, becomes more authoritative, not less. The chain of transmission from ancestor to elder to adult to child is itself understood as a sacred obligation. You did not receive this knowledge. You are borrowing it from those who will come after you. In 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBES, released a global assessment report warning that up to 1 million species face extinction within decades. In the same report, a specific finding stood out. Regions managed by indigenous communities had significantly higher biodiversity than regions under conventional conservation management. The report found that indigenous and community-managed lands, which cover roughly 22% of the Earth's surface, hold about 80% of the remaining biodiversity. This is not an accident. It is the outcome of thousands of years of knowledge systems that treat ecological relationship as a moral obligation rather than a resource management challenge. But those knowledge systems are disappearing at a rate that mirrors the biodiversity loss they have been sustaining. UNESCO estimated in a 2003 report that of the roughly 6,000 languages spoken on Earth, half are expected to disappear within this century. Each of those languages carries a knowledge system. Each of those systems represents thousands of years of accumulated ecological observation. The loss is not just cultural, it is scientific. Indigenous scholars and activists have been making this argument for decades. Vine Deloria Jr., the Standing Rock Sioux author and lawyer, wrote in his 1969 book, Custer Died for Your Sins, that Western society's treatment of indigenous knowledge as primitive was not an intellectual error so much as a political one. Recognizing the sophistication of indigenous knowledge systems would require acknowledging that the communities holding them had rights. Territorial, intellectual, political, that colonial structures had spent centuries denying. That political dimension has not resolved, but the intellectual dimension is shifting. Since the 1990s, a growing body of researchers, many of them indigenous scholars themselves, have argued for what is called two-eyed seeing, a framework developed by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall in Canada. The idea is that indigenous and Western knowledge systems are not competitors. They are complementary lenses. Each sees things the other cannot. Universities in New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and increasingly across Africa and Latin America have begun formally integrating indigenous knowledge frameworks into research methodologies. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted in 2007, explicitly recognized the right of indigenous peoples to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. The pharmaceutical, agricultural, and conservation industries have increasingly recognized that indigenous knowledge is not background color for a documentary. It is a source of functional, testable, applicable understanding that the world cannot afford to lose. The healer selecting that leaf in the Amazon basin at the beginning of this video is not working from instinct. He is working from a 400-year peer-reviewed knowledge system. The peer reviewers are his ancestors. The journal is the living community. The archive is a chain of human beings who cared enough to remember. What makes indigenous knowledge worth studying is not that it is ancient. It is that it worked. For thousands of years, across every climate and ecosystem on Earth, communities developed ways of knowing their world that were precise, adaptive, and deeply integrated with the conditions of survival.